Hey guys, welcome back. Today I'm finally sitting down and answering all the questions you guys had for me on Instagram on Anthurium, Anthurium care, just Anthurium related questions in general. This was originally meant to be like a repot and chat type of video, but I was pulling plants to repot and then I realized I don't have enough plants to do a repot video. So we're just gonna sit here, and also I don't really feel like repotting today. Also, as I was going through the questions, I was realizing that a lot of them will require me to like pull things to show you, and that just wasn't gonna be conducive to a repot. So I'm just gonna be sitting here. This is definitely the type of video where you just kind of play it in the background. It's not going to be a visually stimulating kind of video, but hopefully if you submitted a question, I'll be able to get to it in some way or the other. And also, big disclaimer, I'm going to be answering these questions based on my experience, the way I like to grow. Only you know your environment and your own lifestyle and the style of care you like to give your plants, so take this with a giant grain of salt and just tweak it to your environment. As usual, I have not made any sort of outline or any sort of script, so I'm going to just in my mind look at the questions and try to go topic by topic. But that said, I hope I don't jump around too much, but I cannot guarantee it. I think I'm going to start with all the questions relating to substrate and roots and watering, because I think that's going to be a good foundation. To preface, I want to say for anyone who's new to this channel, the majority of my anthurium are potted in some type of tree fern mix. So either tree fern fiber mixed with a lot of like gritty stuff like pumice, perlite, lechuza pond, like DIY pond, that kind of thing, or that mixed with some sort of soil component like a peat based or like a compost based soil. And there's a couple that are potted in DIY pond, but the majority are in like some sort of tree fern mix. If you want more information on the tree fern soil mix or the DIY pond mix, I will link these two videos in the description. A few people asked if I was still using that tree fern soil mix, which I loved so much, or if I'm just like kind of moving over to a tree fern DIY pond mix. I got a lot of this kind of question when I stopped using pond so much and I moved over to tree fern soil, and like in no way am I saying like I don't like pond anymore because I started using this substrate more heavily. I tend to do this I don't know, like I think it matches with my care in certain seasons and eras of my life. And then as my substrates change, I can like kind of like tailor my care for that plant depending on what it's potted in. But I will say I still firmly believe that tree fern soil is a great substrate. The reason why I'm not using it that much is because I didn't repurchase my soil components. So I had a lot more of the other components like tree fern, all the DIY pond components, but I was lacking that soil component, and I hadn't fully decided which soil component I wanted to use. So until I buy that, I'm just kind of using like a tree fern pond mix at the moment. So to answer the question, I still really like tree fern soil and I fully intend to use it again. It just hasn't been a priority for me to restock the soil until like it's absolutely necessary. And also at the same time, I am really enjoying tree fern mix with DIY pond. It overall is a more expensive substrate because the soil is able to like kind of densify the mix, but at the same time it's working really well. And as like, I guess this doesn't really apply to a lot of people, but as someone who's doing YouTube, I want to give something like a lot of tries so I can give my honest experience on it. But that said, I am still one of those people who are firmly in like the tree fern fiber is magic camp. From tropical plants all the way to desert plants, it has worked really well for me. There was a lot of questions on how to deal with root rot, and I'm not going to get into like the deep trenches of root rot because there's like so many scenarios that can cause root rot. I think the first thing that you should try to identify is whether it is dry rot or wet rot. The easiest way to determine what kind of rot it is actually get the plant out of the pot, remove the substrate, and actually be able to like look up close and determine the condition of the roots. But personally, before I do that, I would actually determine whether or not it's necessary to remedy that. I would guess that if you looked at the root system of any of my plants, 99% of them have rot in some form or the other, like dead root, like bits somewhere in the root mass. And I think it's kind of important to remember that roots, like all parts of the plant matter, are not immortal, and some parts of it will die and they will grow new stuff, new roots, new foliage, new stem. So personally, if I don't see that the plant is actively declining, if maybe just like the oldest one leaf is dying, but the overall growth is outpacing the dying off parts, I may not actually get the plant out of the pot prematurely before it's actually ready to be uppotted or cut or whatever. But let's say your plant is actually actively declining. You can see there's a lot of rot in the roots, take it out. Wet rot due to lack of airflow, too much water leading to excessive anaerobic bacterial activity will mean that the roots look like They look like wet brown, but kind of like fat and soggy. Whereas dry rot, meaning that your plant dried out too much, the roots deflated, and then you introduced water, it will look exactly like that. It looks like flat and deflated. There may be like a plump section of root and then just like flattened end of the root. So a lot of the anthurium we have in cultivation right now are plants that really enjoy being consistently moist, as in like they don't like to fully dry out. The exception to this will be some Mexican species like clarinervium, with really, really fat roots. They do enjoy like a little bit more drying out and bordering on fully drying out between waterings, but the majority of them do really well under consistency. So like not letting them fully dry out, but when they do fully dry out, oftentimes this is where you will find the deflated roots that do not rehydrate. So they will just be kind of dead plant matter that when you water it, that's like, you know, food for bacteria. So I think how to combat this, there's a few layers to this. First of all, I highly recommend some sort of beneficial microbes for your plants. I use Great White. I think a lot of you guys use Great White. It has beneficial mycorrhizal fungi. It has trichoderma, which is a beneficial mold, and it also has beneficial bacteria. Also, the fertilizer that I use, TPS1, also has beneficial microbes like bacteria in it. I attribute Great White for the ability for plants to kind of root out faster, be just a little bit more resilient, also mitigates transplant shock. I think it just like, it's a safety blanket for me. If there's a little bit of rot, I trust that the beneficials will kind of take care of it. So Great White and TPS1 are the products I use. I can't really speak to any other ones. I haven't tried them. And then the other thing to combat root rot is to determine, like, based on what kind of rot you're seeing the most of. Are you seeing more wet rot? Are you seeing more dry rot? Are you an underwater? Are you overwater? That would help you determine the direction in which you should amend your substrate to fit into your watering style. So for me personally, I'm an underwaterer. I think like a lot of people, I started out in plants as an overwaterer because I was just like so excited and I just wanted to water all the time, and I was spending a lot of time just like looking at my plants, and I just wanted to like give them more love. And so more love means more water. But then as time goes on and the more plants I got, the harder it is to keep up with the watering. And then, you know, like there's other things I want to enjoy in life, and I don't want my plants to dictate my whole life, so I let them dry out sometimes. So my tendency with anthurium has been to pot it as dense as possible while still allowing for airflow, and that's like a fine line to ride. So I have gone too dense in the past where it was like rotting, like wet rotting plants more than I would have liked. And I've also gone too coarse where the substrate dries out too fast and I was like withering plants. So not this current substrate, but the last one I was heavily using was the tree fern mix with sea soil component, which was way too dense. And I think there's something about sea soil that my plants didn't like. I don't know if it's the pH, I didn't really test it. So my current substrate, which is the tree fern DIY pond mix, I find is a correction of the too dense, and I'll show you what it looks like. So tree fern mixed with inorganic materials like perlite and stuff is not new to me, but I've been using it a lot more now, and I've been making it a lot more grittier than I have in the past. So in the past, I've used like tree fern with like a little bit of lechuza pond mix in there, but now I'm using more like a 50/50 mix. So this is roughly a 1-to-1 ratio by volume. So when I mix this substrate, I fill the tree fern to about here and then pond to about here. I leave a little bit of room for mixing. And I feel like with this kind of grittiness, the particles are not huge. So it's not like giant, like big orchid bark chunks. It's not like big charcoal chunks. It's all quite small. And I think with this mix, it's really easy to tailor it to both over and underwaterers. Because the particles are small but even and sturdy, there's always a guaranteed network for water to flow through, little pockets of air, but also it's not so giant that it's going to dry out super fast. And you can also further amend the potting situation like I do, which is I put a layer at the bottom, and then I will sometimes sit the plant in water. So for example, here's a plant that needs water. This is a Carla Pap by Carla Dress. This is a hybrid done by Pau and Josh. So this plant needs water. There is leca at the bottom. Hopefully you can see it through this little slit. I'm gonna water it right now, and then I'll let it sit in the runoff, but the leca layer is slightly higher than it, so it's only gonna sit in water in a leca layer. And I find that for me, this doesn't result in a lot of root rot, whereas if I didn't have that leca layer at the bottom, it's going to be just straight up mud at the bottom. And so as an underwaterer, this is a way for me to have a fairly gritty mix with the tree fern. This is the tree fern pond mix. It's like not exactly the same. This was a different batch. This one has some orchiata in it, I think. But it's essentially like 1 part tree fern to 1 part like amendments. And the reservoir will kind of extend the time between waterings for me. I had a few questions asking me about this setup and like how I'm able to let it sit in water without rotting the plants. And I think the leco layer does play a big part in that. So to kind of sum up the setup, it's a tree fern heavily amended with pon and other things, leco layer to about here, and then try to keep the reservoir like at the leco layer or slightly below. And I don't think you should be seeing a lot of rot with that. That said, if I let this completely dry out, there is still the potential for dry rot, but wet rot, I don't really see it happening so much with this, at least not to a degree where it presents itself as like a big problem in my collection. And in terms of knowing exactly when to water, it's not necessarily when the reservoir runs out, because this could run out and this still be full of water, and that's not when I would water typically. In an ideal world, if I'm on top of it, I would water when the top layer becomes that dry color. So I just water my plants, so I don't really have a good example to show you of a dry tree fern fiber, but this is tree fern soil. This is leftovers from a repot, but this is fully like dusty dry. This is the color of tree fern fiber with some moisture, and then tree fern fiber that is freshly watered is quite dark. So the color of the surface is like my first indicator. The second, of course, is picking it up and feeling the weight of it relative to the pot size. And then the last thing is how much to water depends on what plant it is, whether it's one of those like outliers that don't want that much water all the time, like a clarinervium, or if it's a plant that needs to be like swampy at all times. I'm talking like Dabile. In my experience, like Bevep and Dressleri have seemed to like it a little bit more on the wet side. Plants that have really thin little roots tend to not tolerate drying out at all, so I try to keep those a little bit wetter. But at the end of the day, you can do everything perfectly and you'll still get root rot. I still get root rot all the time, and I probably got more root rot in the last year than I have in like the first part of my YouTube journey, because things just got a little bit crazy for me. Like my life got a little bit distracting and I wasn't able to really like pay enough attention to my plants. So I was kind of guessing at what was going wrong with them. I really think that plant care, just like tending to your plants, really does overlap a lot with like propagating, because with a propagation, you are trying to root a cutting of a plant. But when a plant is not healthy, you're also trying to root that plant and kind of bring it back to life. And it's all about balancing light with water, how much water it is, and putting it in an environment that allows it to take up the water it needs and reduce the transpiration of water. So you want it to like, you know, plump up more than it's like losing water. So oftentimes when we're trying to do this, we kind of like overdo the water. Like we kind of smother it with too much humidity, too much water, and it's almost like suffocating in this like wet swamp. So my best advice would be to pay close attention to what's happening with the plant. Also, like what's happening and progressing as time goes on. Pay attention to the changes you make that result in a positive change for the plant. Pay attention to things that result in a negative change for the plant, and try to work out from that equation like what is actually going on. If you see some root rot and the plant looks perky, it's fine, it's actively growing and the new leaves are forming nicely, it's probably not anything to worry about. If you see root rot and the plant is like looking a little bit limp, it's getting crispy on the edges, it's looking a little wrinkly when you feel it, and the leaves are feeling like a little softer than usual, the leaf has lost a bit of its like turgidity, then there is a problem with its ability to take up water. So just try to notice everything about the plant and pick it up and feel it and document, or maybe just like mentally document what is going on as time goes on. And as you're doing stuff to it to try to mitigate the damage, is it actually working? If not, then like stop doing that one thing. Okay, so while we're on the root reservoir topic, I want to show you the catch trays, like reservoir type things that I use, because I get these questions all the time. It really is just like whatever I can find, but I'll just show you what are my favorites, I guess. So I am a huge fan of the squarish pots, so a lot of them are going to be ones that fit those. Oh, this has a big spider web on it. This plant, by the way, is Carla Yard by Stripey Meg. This was from IAS last year from Paul. So this one's in a like good old fashioned deli cup. I want to say this is a 24-ounce size. And I also sometimes will use this size, which is, I believe, wait, it can't be 32 ounces. How would this be 24 and this is 32? Maybe that's right. I'm pretty sure this is 32. Whether this is 24, I'm not 100% sure. I will use this if I'm out of this. This is my first choice for deli containers. This is a little bit higher or taller than the actual pot. So the leaves tend to kind of like sit on the rim of the deli container, which is not my favorite. I also have a lot of these from the garden center. They're just kind of like these cheap little kind of somewhat breakable saucers that are somewhat deep enough to keep a reservoir. So anything around the 4-inch size, I will use that. This one is one of my hybrids, Carla B Veb. This one is one I just kind of threw in my tent to see if it would grow any different than inside of a bin, but you know, it's kind of been the same. That style of saucer I have in all different sizes, 4-inch, 6-inch, up to like 10-inch. For the smaller square pots, this is like the 3-inch pot size. I've been using a lot of this cup, which I used to get a lot of questions on, not so much anymore, but this is a cup that I got from my old workplace that like they were throwing out all these yogurt container cups. So I can't tell you where to get them. You can probably find something similar on Amazon, but once this is out, I don't know where to get any more of this. I forgot to mention this is Pat Voldemort itself. There's a new leaf coming. This one probably needs a repot, but again, I don't have enough plants to repot for this to be a repot video. Another one I really like for the medium, like 4-inch square pot is this. This is a glass container I got from Dollarama. I don't know if your dollar store would have this. This one is the Bivet by DF from NXT Plants. It's doing so well and it's growing so nice and dark for me in my tent, and it's pushing another leaf. This thing is growing really fast. I'm gonna need to repot it soon. Look at all those roots. This one is in a pumice, lava rock, perlite stratum mix with a leco layer at the bottom. For square glass vessels like that, you can find bigger ones at the thrift store, but I don't know of any like retailer that sells them. Like I haven't seen a big one at the dollar store. I've only seen that like 4-inch size. And then for the medium square pot, like the around 5-inch size, I've been really liking this, which is, I didn't buy it with the intention of using it as a reservoir, but it actually fits this pot so perfectly. This is my quote unquote Jose plant, which is a Fort Sherman Rolflinum by Dress Carla. This one's looking a little bit under the weather because it just finished producing seeds. But overall, it didn't decline as much as I would have expected after its like first berry batch. This is about the extent of the dying leaves. They're the 3 bottom leaves. The newer leaves seem to be doing okay. And then it just put out a new leaf, which is so red and so pretty. It looks like at the back, you can see all the blister variegation, but it's hard to say what will show up on the front until it's a little bit more expanded than this. But to go back to the reservoir, this is a kind of like critter transport container that I got from the reptile store. I'll show you what it looks like. This is what it looks like when you buy it. I also use this to germinate seeds. So usually when I germinate seeds, I'll do a cell tray or 2. So this is my preferred way of germinating seeds because they're isolated. They're not in a community pot and they're not competing for nutrients and resources. And when I go to repot them, it's a little bit easier to than like when they're all tangled up in the root department. I know we're talking about reservoirs, but I just want to get this out of the way. And then if I do like a couple of trays of this and I still have a bunch of seeds left over, I'll put the rest in something like this. So this container actually has like little air holes, tiny perforations here. And then the lid has a little flap that you can open. I keep it slightly open to grow seedlings. So this is actually the seedlings from that plant that I just showed you, the Jose plant. Some of them are germinating. I would say like it's maybe like a 50 to 60% germination rate, but in the trays, they seem to be, no, it's about the same. So I will be growing this out a little bit more to make sure they're not all duds because I'm not 100% sure of the strength of the mother plant. It is a pretty robust grower, but it was also its first berry batch, so it hasn't proven itself yet. This I got, if you're local to me, I got it from Rogers Aquarium. It's in Surrey. I would not get this purely as a reservoir thing, but because it's versatile, it's kind of nice to have because you can use it to germinate seeds, and when you have a bunch left over, you can use it as like a drainage catch pot for the medium square pot, which is a perfect fit for this. Okay, next there were a couple questions on lighting and specifically like how to determine what's the best lighting for anthurium. So I'm not a lighting expert or anything, but I've always kind of veered towards more lighting than less lighting in order to induce darkness in anthurium. So my tent is historically where a lot of my anthuriums at least grew up before they were too big to fit in, then I moved them out. And inside this tent, there are 7 10-watt Barina lights. So there's like 2 at the top, 1 on each side that are vertical pointing inwards, and then like 3 more right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah. And then on top of that, the tent walls are silver reflective. So when the tent doors close, there's a lot of light bouncing around. So everything in there gets a fair amount of light. On this shelf, I also have a 10-watt Barina on each shelf. I have a Soltech, which is a 32 watt at the top. On this shelf, there are two Soltechs at the top. For this area here, there's a 10-watt Barina pointing at these bins, which are growing seedlings of various sizes. I give my anthurium a fair amount of light because I'm trying to get them to grow fast. And whether or not that has worked against me, I don't really know. Sometimes I get stressed out by too much growth, but at the same time, more growth means more stuff to talk about in videos. So it's like a personal balance for me. And on top of that, while less light can induce more darkness in certain velvet leaf anthurium, there are also velvet leaf anthurium that actually get blacker with more light. So I've played around with that as well. My personal approach to determining the light levels for anthurium and whether they need to be moved a little bit back, just like pulled away from light a little bit, or maybe try to put it underneath like a larger plant to shade it a little bit. My approach has been to give it as much light as possible until I can see that it's looking like kind of pale and like lackluster, or certainly if the plant is burning, I will move it away from the light. But I have found that with the Barina T5s, which are 10 watts, it's really hard to burn plants. Like there's just simply not strong enough to do so. But yeah, in general, my approach has been to give it lots of light. Light means food for the plant and means faster growth, and it means that it also takes up water faster. So I worry less about overwatering, but it also means that I have to stay on top of underwatering. And then outside of this general approach, I know there are certain plants that can take a lot of light while still looking really great. So Carla Blackier for me is one of those plants that can take a lot of light while still producing really black leaves. On the flip side, I found that BVEP kind of appreciate a little bit dimmer conditions, but if you're moving plants from lighter to darker, darker to lighter, it's really important to also tailor the water at the same time. So if a plant is used to getting a lot of light and taking up water really quickly, then when it goes into a darker spot, it will take up water less frequently and less efficiently. So it's important to also pull back on the watering a little bit according to like how much the water is being taken up by that plant. Another visual way to determine if the plant is getting the right amount of light for its optimal growth is to look at like, are the petioles abnormally long for that plant? Is that plant looking like it's like 80% petiole and 20% leaf? And is that even normal for that species or for that hybrid? So I've gotten plants before in the past where it came to me with like quite long petioles and a little leaf at the top. And based on the appearance of the plant, it didn't seem to me like it should have abnormally long petioles. So for that plant, I gave it more light, and then the next leaf that came out of it had like a more proportionate like kind of petiole to leaf size. You can also get a read on it by looking at like how the plant is facing. So if the plant is like kind of pointing up, pointing sideways, pointing down, it might be ducking away from too much light or kind of trying to reach towards light, and all the leaves are kind of facing one weird direction. So for my lighting, I try to keep my lights as much as possible slightly in front of the plant. So for example, Barina bars that I've attached to shelves, I try to attach them to the front of the shelves, and then like the plant is slightly behind it, so the plant has incentive to face forward, so I don't have all the leaves facing up like this. Same thing for my tent where I have these vertical bars facing inwards for the tent. There's one here, there's one on the other side. It's intended to try to point light inward so the plants can kind of just like sit and look forward. And then same thing for the shelf behind me. I have the Soltex kind of in front of the shelf, but I have them tilted pointing at the shelf. So there's a couple of questions on nutrients and what I'm using for my plants. So like I said, mentioned before, I use TPS1 as my all-purpose fertilizer. It's like kind of a complete fertilizer with added beneficial bacteria in it. I also use CalMag, which I am currently out of, which I really need to go buy some more of. But in an ideal world, I do a CalMag at least once a month. Every plant, when I pot it up, gets inoculated with Great White. And if I can keep on top of it, in an ideal world, I would re-inoculate it once every like couple of months. I think that is all I'm using that I can say is like products I would recommend. I've used other things before that I just like, I can't really tell what it did, so I'm not gonna like talk about them. I'm not the YouTuber to tell you from a scientific standpoint the chemistry of what's going on in the soil. I just try to do stuff and try things based on what is working for other people, and then if it's working for me too, then it's kind of like a if it's not broke, don't fix it thing. Although in saying that, I am kind of like thinking of trying a new fertilizer. Not that like TPS1's not working for me, but there's one thing about TPS1 that annoys me. It's that like when it dries, it crystallizes. And so it like causes kind of my pump to get like clogged a little bit. It's a little bit messy when it like drips and then crystallizes. So that's one thing I don't like about TPS1. It also is slightly expensive and it's only available in the States. So I was thinking maybe GTS Foliage Focus. If you've used that or if you use something that you really recommend, let me know. I also have used Dynagrow, or it now is called, not Dynagrow. It used to be called Dynagrow Foliage Pro, now is Super Thrive Foliage Pro because Super Thrive acquired it, but I think it should be exactly the same. That is also a solid all-in-one fertilizer. I kind of use that downstairs, or I've used that before to patch me through when I run out of TPS1 and I need something to kind of carry me through until I get some more. I use Dynagrow. So if you're using something that is like just blowing your mind as to how good it is and it's fairly straightforward and simple to use, like I don't really want to do like a multi-step like mixing and then like waiting and then mixing and waiting. I'm not really interested in that. So if you know something that fits that criteria, please let me know. I'm always interested. Okay, so there's a couple of questions related to humidity and ambient humidity. So in terms of like acclimating, it's interesting because usually there's questions based on like how to acclimate them out of high humidity into ambient humidity. And then there was actually one talking about how to acclimate it into high humidity. So I'll kind of talk about that. First of all, let's address the acclimating out of like a tent into ambient and like how I would go about doing it. So my approach to that is always based on making sure that the plant has a really large root system relative to its overall plant size. So it's not like an exact science or exact measurement, but basically I'm just kind of looking at the root mass in relation to the overall plant size. Do I think this root system has what it takes to take up water when there's less moisture in the air? I'll also take into account whether that plant is kind of overall very vigorous, very robust, and if I think it can continue growing in ambient. I don't mind if there's a transition period where it puts out leaves that kind of rip a little bit, but I think eventually we'll transition into a drier climate. So usually when we're talking about velvet leaf anthurium, a lot of the hybrids will do fine like that. But for me, living in Canada, moving a plant out of my tent into ambient always means slower growth, and I just have to like make my peace with that. If I'm not okay with that plant growing slower, I will do whatever I can to keep it in my tent. So sometimes that means cutting excess leaves off, sometimes that means taking a bottom cutting, so reducing the root mass and letting that plant kind of like restart again. Yeah, that is generally my approach, but mainly it's like make sure that it has a good strong root system, and then as I'm transitioning it out, I might even repot it into an even bigger pot because I want to make sure that that pot is roomy enough that it doesn't dry out super fast. So if a plant is kind of big root system, really snug in the pot coming out of the tent, I would definitely be potting it into a bigger pot. But someone was saying they moved all their plants out of ambient, like they set up a tent and they moved a bunch of plants into the tent and a lot of them tanked. I don't know exactly what happened to these plants because they didn't mention like any symptoms or anything, but it could be a few things. One reason could be that it's too hot, like maybe it was transitioned in the summer and the tent is quite a bit hotter than ambient. So sometimes when I open the tent, like this gush of hot air comes out. I haven't seen heat stress in my tent, but also this summer hasn't been insanely hot for us in Vancouver. So if you're in a really hot climate and you don't have air conditioning and your tent is really hot, that could mean like going into a tent might stress the plant from heat. One other reason could be that the plants may be staying too wet for too long if the watering has not been adjusted for a high humidity environment. And another thing that might be also related to the watering thing is there enough light inside of that tent to allow for the plant to actually take up the water? Someone asked how to avoid tearing on emergence when already in high humidity. I will say I don't really get that problem so much in my tent unless it's like physical ripping from things like rubbing up against each other, but not the plant ripping itself as it's expanding. So if it's ripping as it's coming out of the sheath because it's getting caught in the sheath and it's like not able to come out smoothly, I always recommend getting a spray bottle. I just use like tap water, spray that emergent leaf so it's lubricated enough to kind of glide through. So I will do this when I see an emergent leaf struggling to the point where like the petiole is bending. So like the leaf is trying to come out and like the petiole is doing this kind of thing. But if it's kind of looking like it's coming out straight, I don't bother doing anything with it. Now, if the leaf is getting like munched up, like I'll show you this. This is happening in ambient, so it's not quite the same, but this kind of tearing that's happening as the leaf is expanding. So it's already made it out, and as it's expanding, it's like tearing itself. If this is happening in high humidity, I would bet that it's a nutrient related thing. It's not necessarily nutrient deficient, but it may be able to benefit from some CalMag. So the calcium in CalMag is meant to strengthen the cell walls of the plant. So it should combat things like this when it's not humidity related. I feel like the rest are kind of like hard to categorize. So I'm just gonna tell you the question and answer it. What is the best time to take the top cutting? So oftentimes when I'm showing you guys plants, you'll hear me saying like, I need to repot it because there's so much stem above the substrate. I'm gonna use this plant as an example. So part of this is because when the plant grows big enough to be taller than the substrate, the plant will try to root, but unless the ambient humidity is high enough to encourage the root to keep going until it reaches the substrate, it's just gonna be like little nubbins like this. So if I took a top cutting of this plant, it probably will survive, but it will probably decline for a little bit. For this plant, if I really wanted to take a cutting, I wouldn't necessarily pot it up, but if I could try to do a little collar or something to encourage roots to grow in. And whenever I take cuttings of anthurium, I always like prioritize the health of the top because that's usually the part of the plant that I keep. So I go to the top and kind of look at like where on the stem the roots are, and then I kind of like go down until I feel like I have enough roots to sustain the top, and then I cut the bottom. So that might mean I get a few nodes at the bottom, it might mean I only get one node at the bottom, but the point is I am prioritizing the top transitioning or like recovering from the cut as quick as possible. So my general practice is to keep sizing up the pot as it grows. So as soon as it fills up one pot, size it up to the next size or like 2 sizes up. And that for me is the way to size up anthurium the quickest. And if I keep on top of that, that means that the top cutting or the top section of the plant has a strong root system. So when I do eventually want to cut the plant, it's not just all roots in the bottom like 2-3 nodes of the plant. But some anthurium just grow so fast, and there's a lot of internodal spacing. So it can grow tall much faster. Like I want to say like Forgetii, Papilolaminum. Some plants like Carloblachiae, King of Spades have very tight internodal spacing, so you don't have to worry about like vertical substrate so much. So for these ones that grow too tall for their own good, a collar is a really good solution. Here's an example of a collar I made. So this one is Dark Phoenix by Ralph Lynham Fort Sherman. So I have these like, what were they called? No, not sheep protectors. I don't remember. I used to use these to make moss poles, but I don't really use moss poles anymore. So I use this to make a little collar. So I basically make a strip. Let me see if I can actually show you. I'm gonna use this Russo pot extender to demonstrate. So if I were to make my own, I have a strip like this. This one is a lot taller. On one side, I cut from the bottom halfway up, and then on the other side, I cut from the top halfway down. So then they would like slide and slot in like this, and that's like my little collar. The Russo ones, it's more like a belt like this. And then you can stack these, so this will connect to the next one. I think this side, yeah, this side is supposed to be into the substrate. And then if you want to stack it, the next one would have feet like this, and it will kind of slot into here. I would be remiss if I did not plug my friend Carson's pot extenders. So this is what his pot extenders look like. They're 3D printed. I will link his shop in the description. How do you transition seedlings? It is my biggest failure. No, don't say that. Okay, so seedlings. First of all, I want to say that I don't use heat mats, and I don't recommend heat mats. I'm not saying it's wrong to use a heat mat, but I wouldn't be the one to recommend it. I also don't think that the person who asked this uses heat mats. I'm pretty sure she doesn't, but I've also seen plenty of instances where people put their seedlings on a heat mat inside of like a Mills bowl or inside of a tent, and they basically are just like slow cooking their seedlings. One thing to remember is when you have your seedlings in like a bin like this, or like a little cell tray like this with a dome, and you have the light over top, it is a little bit warmer inside here than outside. So unless you're growing seedlings in like somewhere very cold, it's winter time, you're growing in your garage, maybe then a heat mat might be necessary, but I don't do that, so I can't really speak to that. So these ones were germinated near to the start of summer. These are possibly self, so my Carla Wu 1 self, so S2. So the bigger ones in here are getting to the point where they're almost ready to be transitioned out. So this one, for example, is the biggest one inside this tray. It's pushed out a leaf. So once this is out, depending on how big it is, I might move it out into its own pot. I don't even necessarily wait for it to fully fill this out with roots, but there are some roots kind of peeking out the bottom here. So what I have been doing lately is moving them into this 3-inch pot. This one I ordered on Amazon. So I think this is the Foxani brand. They're really rigid. Like they feel like a nice strong quality. They're very similar to these. They're not the same make or anything, but this is like a nice little upsize and it can grow in this for a little while. And then from here, I move it up into this size. So it's quite a big upsize from there. I messed around with the substrate quite a bit for these particular seedlings. These are the Carla Beveps, and these are the smallest ones. I found that the tree fern pot mix was dense enough for seedling roots, which are quite fine, and seedlings do not like to dry out. So if anything, I try to keep them on the wetter side. A lot of times I've seen people's pictures of their seedling cups, and they're basically using the same mix as they would a very large plant. So the amendments are like large chunks of like bark or large chunks of like coconut. And unless you're like basically sitting that in water, they have a really strong chance of drying out, which for a seedling is really hard to recover from. I have another shelf over there where it's sitting right on top of the floor vent. So in the winter time, the heat goes on and that side of the bin that's right over the floor vent keeps drying out way faster than the other side. And I found that those seedlings in that spot that would not be as consistently wet as the others were growing much slower, looking a little bit sicklier. But yeah, when I transition a seedling from that little cell tray to this, it's basically the same thing. I pot it up, inoculate with Great White, and I keep the lid on not 100% of the way. I keep it on like this. So I keep about like 1 to 2 centimeters of a crack. And then from there, I move it into the 4-inch size. So this is another of the Carla Beveps. I try not to do that with all of them, although it would have sized them up faster because I didn't want to ship so many plants at this size. If you got seedlings from me and it came in a no drainage cup, or from anyone, and it came in a little cup with no drainage, I would recommend that you pot it into a drainage pot. It can definitely grow in those little no drainage parfait cups, but I have found from the ones I have kept and have not potted up, they have grown so much slower than the ones in drainage. Okay, next question. What is the difference between a self and a clone? So I will use this plant as an example. So this one is my contaminated Carla from NSC. This one I have selfed. So I took pollen from its last inflow, I froze it, and when it flowered again, I put it onto the next flower. So this has been self-pollinated. So when the seeds are ready, they will be selflings of this plant. But as this plant is a hybrid, the offspring will not be genetically identical to this plant, so there will be some variability on what traits are expressed. The pollen parent of this plant is unknown. All we know is that Carla is the mother, so the offspring might express more traits of one parent versus the other. And then a clone of a plant is genetically identical, so it's vegetatively propagated, so by cutting, by TC, and I'm not an expert on TC, but I do know that because TC is such rapid multiplication of plants that there's more chance of mutations to occur. So when cells are dividing, sometimes mistakes happen. DNA does not get copied over to the next cell in this exact same way, so that's where mutations come from. This is where the propagation can start to look different from the plant that it was cut from. So for example, last year there was a cutting of a soul reaper, a pap soul reaper that the homebody was selling, and it was like really like crepey. It almost looked like muslin, and it had like really, like Soul Reaper is already pretty wavy, but it just looked really exaggerated. And it was a cutting of Soul Reaper, so it just was that one tiny chance of a cutting resulting in a mutation. But anyway, in general, when you TC a plant, when you cut a plant, when you take an offset off of a plant, it's going to be genetically identical to the mother. There should be no vast differences in how the plant looks, whereas a selfling is not guaranteed to look like the mother plant. And it will depend on like whether the mother plant is a hybrid, is it a complex hybrid, even more chance of variability. It was a really good question that I want to talk about. I want to find it. Here it is. Best, safest way to test a new substrate. How long to wait before repotting more plants? I love this question. I have talked about this before, but I haven't said it recently, so I want to say it again. If you are trying something new, try to go about it safely. And I feel like it's easier said than done, because when you see something working really well for someone and you want those same results on your plants, it's really tempting to do it to everything all at once. But because everyone's environment and climate and everything is so different, what works perfectly for someone can be like a death sentence for your plants. So I think my advice for trying something new that you're not familiar with is kind of like maybe twofold. So the first thing I would try it on is the plant that already is not happy in its current setup. So if the plant clearly needs to get out of its current substrate, pot, whatever, trying a new substrate on it could be really easy to determine whether or not there's an improvement in the plant because it's already not doing well. If you want to move a plant over that's currently quite healthy and happy, but you just want to try something new, I would try it on a plant that you kind of know quite well, so you know what it looks like when it's happy, you know how resilient it is, and maybe try to choose one that is fairly forgiving. So you now have like kind of two different testing pools, one that's like not so happy and maybe a little bit frail and kind of a little fragile, and one that's quite robust, and just kind of see. I would give enough time in the testing period to see new root growth, how it compares to like things you used in the past. Definitely a new leaf growth, see how that leaf develops. I would see how long that substrate takes to dry out and see if that meshes well with your style of watering. Does it require water too frequently, not frequently enough? Are you seeing wet rot? Are you seeing dry rot? I think the testing period is going to differ from person to person depending on how bad the problem is that you're trying to fix. If you're not really trying to fix any problems, you're just doing it for funsies, maybe just do it on a few and sprinkle it in, but it's not like an urgent problem you need to fix that you need to do it to all of your plants. But I really appreciate this question being asked because I do really believe in a testing period where you can test something on a small pool of plants where you can kind of just see if it's for you. Because if you're like trying pond for the first time, for example, it's so different than soil in terms of like how to water, how to fertilize. I mean, maybe not that different, but it's different enough that it may not be for you, and it's not cheap to get a lot of pond. And if you decide you hate it, then there's so many plants that you have to like correct this substrate issue on that I don't think it's worth the thrill of trying it on all your plants all at once. Okay, last question because I can feel my brain turning into mush. How do you know that you have plant burnout? Signs and symptoms, please. I have like a whole video on this, but it's worth touching on again because it's something that I go in and out of all the time. For me, plant burnout is when I look at my plants and just feel dread. I experienced this early in this year where there was just too much going on in my life. I was dealing with grief, and when I looked at my plants and they were not doing well, I could not give a crap. I was just like, I don't like, what do you want me to do? Water you? For me, I feel like I've cultivated a set of systems that work for me, and I'll give you a few of them. So one thing is like making sure all my plant care stuff, all my substrates, everything are in their own bin. They have their own shelf. They're really easy to take in and out and like use and then just like slot back in. So that really helps. My fertilizer is in pump bottles. So all I have to do is 1 or 2 pumps into my watering can, fill it up, water. My plants being potted with leca means that when I water, I can water really deeply and leave some water on it. So that means like when I go away on vacation, they can sit in a little bit more water and be okay for a little bit longer. I've also been selling plants for quite a few years, so there is an outlet for me to sell plants. So if you're not already like in some sort of plant group, interacting with people so people know who you are, at least by name, not necessarily by like the plants you sell, but just know that you are a person, a legitimate person, I would try to like integrate into some communities so that when you do decide to downsize, you have an outlet to get rid of plants and ideally sell them and make some money back. But at the same time, there's going to be points where maybe a plant's not worth selling because it is riddled with pests. You don't want to sell plants that are riddled with pests. You don't want to sell plants that are, I mean, I personally don't want to sell plants that are really struggling, really ugly, very unhealthy. Another way I try to downsize sometimes when I'm on the fence of like whether or not I truly want to let go of this plant. So my little in-between thing is to give it to Charmaine or give it to a friend because I still feel like it's still there, it's still within reach. If I really regret it and want it back, you know, I could ask for it back, ask for a cutting of it back. But I think a clear sign of when I'm ready to let go of a plant is when it grows and I don't care. Like I even sometimes will miss a new leaf coming in. And this is not necessarily to do with plant burnout because even when I'm like not burning out and I'm very into plants, I will miss new leaves on plants. And it's because I'm not like gravitated towards that plant to even check on new growth. So this is the point where I'd prefer to sell a plant where it's not necessarily unhealthy. It's still perfectly fine, but maybe I just don't love it as much as I used to. But that has always been kind of like my test for whether or not I will miss that plant if it was gone. And I will say, I can't think of a single plant that I sold that I regretted selling. That might change within the next year as I'm selling more of like seedlings that I produce, that like I sell them before I can see them with their like full express traits. So I might regret selling a seedling that is like particularly nice, but so far I have not regretted anything. But I think my best advice is to set up a set of systems in your plant care, where you do your plant care, to make it as organized and like everything has its place as much as possible, because stress can be caused by like messiness, disorganization. You can also like start to resent your plants and like the way it has like infringed on your lifestyle. And if you're looking at your collection and you're like, I love them all too much, there's not a single one I can bear letting go of, I would say you're probably not at the point where you have too many plants, or maybe you're still in the excitement phase where it's really hard to let go of things. But I think like as time goes on, it becomes more and more normal to you that like what you once loved, you don't have to have forever. And also to continue on to that, like you don't have to own everything you love. So you can love something from afar and not have it in your possession. I also think that that's something that you have to kind of like naturally come into. It's not something you can force yourself to start thinking that way. It also took me some time to come to terms with like I don't necessarily love the same plants today as I used to love before. And I used to love them so wholeheartedly before, but and suddenly just like I don't really care for you anymore. And it's okay to change your mind. Like we're all changing all the time, and I'm not the same person today as I was when I started my channel. The plants I loved back then are definitely not the same as I love now. And 2 years from now, it'll probably change again. And it took me some time to stop feeling like fake or like a hypocrite for changing my mind. This is probably a topic I can go on and on about, but I am going to end this here. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I wasn't able to get to everyone's questions, so if I didn't get to yours, I do apologize. If you do have a very pressing question, please feel free to leave in the comments. If there's enough to warrant another video, I might do another one. Possibly the community can come together in the comments and answer each other's questions. But thank you guys for hanging out today. I love you guys so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Mwah!